Bumpy Johnson's wife shot a mobster in broad daylight. What happened next shocked the Mafia. Gunfire split the afternoon quiet. A mobster fell in front of shocked onlookers, eyes wide, blood seeping through expensive suits. The city whispered. Nobody dared cross Bumpy Johnson. Nobody. The streets of Harlem moved with a rhythm all its own. Children played in alleyways, their laughter bouncing off the brick walls. Men leaned against stoops, cigarette smoke curling lazily toward the afternoon sky. And in the midst of it all, she walked, Bumpy Johnson's wife, measured steps, quiet, deliberate. Her presence alone seemed to pull the city into a slower orbit, the chatter dimming, the rhythm stilled. Eyes tracked her, not all with admiration, some with suspicion, some with thinly veiled contempt. A few whispered to their neighbors, daring each other to comment. Harlem had its rules, and today, one of them would be tested. The mobster had been in town for a week, flaunting his wealth, his audacity. His reputation was built on intimidation, on the assumption that power could be claimed with a sharp word or a swinging fist. But here, in the heart of Bumpy's territory, arrogance had a different cost. Bumpy's wife passed him without looking, her eyes forward, her hands steady at her sides. She did not hurry, but the air thickened with expectation. A single misstep could ignite violence. A single glance could trigger disaster. And yet, she carried herself with a stillness that seemed impossible. Calm, untouchable, a subtle declaration. You cannot dictate terms here. Not to her, not in Bumpy's Harlem. As she reached the corner, the sun caught the barrel of a distant carbine. A shadow moved where it shouldn't. The city held its breath. And in that pause, the inevitability of what was coming pressed down like a weight, heavy and unavoidable. Harlem had felt storms before, but nothing like this. He was waiting, as if the streets themselves had whispered her arrival. The mobster stood beneath the hot glare of the sun, suit sharp, tie loose, a cigarette dangling from fingers that had seen more than their share of blood. His eyes, arrogant and cold, tracked her as she approached, calculating, confident. Harlem recognized him. They knew him by name, by reputation. But here, in Bumpy Johnson's world, reputation alone carried no weight. She slowed as she neared, letting the tension stretch. Words had power, but presence, controlled, deliberate presence, was something else entirely. The mobster's lips curved into a smirk, the kind meant to mock, to belittle, to test. He didn't know yet that he was about to be corrected. Bumpy sends his regards, she said quietly, the words cutting through the thick afternoon air. There was no tremor in her voice, no plea in her tone, just certainty. The street seemed to lean in, every passerby sensing the unspoken rules, sensing the boundary being drawn. He laughed low, dismissive. I don't answer to anyone in Harlem, he said. The words carried defiance, but also a hint of unease, the faint tremor that comes when arrogance meets something it cannot measure. The city watched. The corner was crowded with idle observers, store owners peering from doorways, children pausing mid-step, adults freezing in place. Time slowed. Every heartbeat counted. Every breath seemed louder. Her hand brushed the side of her coat. Not a reach, not a threat, but a signal. Calm, deliberate. Authority without shouting. And in that measured silence, the balance of power shifted. The mobster's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of calculation, a recognition that he had misjudged. The wind carried distant sirens, but here, on this street, only one command held weight. Respect. Bumpy Johnson's wife did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. She simply existed in that space, an immovable force framed by sun and shadow. And the mobster, for the first time, sensed danger. Real, inevitable danger. Every eye on the street understood the rules now. Challenge this, and the consequences would be swift, precise, and unforgiving. The street was silent, the kind of quiet that precedes chaos. Bumpy's wife stood under the flickering shade of a fire escape, her eyes fixed, her posture unyielding. The mobster took another step forward, arrogance curling with menace. He believed himself untouchable, a king in a borrowed kingdom. But Harlem had its own ruler, and today she carried his authority like armor. A whisper of motion, her hand brushing the side of her coat, just enough to reveal the glint of steel. The mobster froze, suspicion creeping in. The city seemed to inhale, every eye locked on the confrontation. Time fractured into pieces. The rustle of paper in the gutter, the distant clang of a streetcar, the soft shuffle of shoes on pavement, all amplified, all holding the weight of inevitability. The first gunshot was sudden, sharp. It split the afternoon like a thunderclap, echoing between the brick walls and fire escapes. The mobster staggered, a look of disbelief frozen on his face. Blood blossomed across his suit, bright and undeniable, marking him in a way that words never could. Screams erupted. Children ran, mothers called out, store windows rattled from the reverberation. But amid the chaos, Bumpy's wife remained steady, every movement measured. There was no panic in her eyes, only focus, a calm assertion of power. Every detail mattered, the angle, the placement, the message. Violence, when executed with precision, demanded respect. The mobster hit the ground, the street now a stage for fear and awe. Passers-by pressed against walls, some frozen, others fleeing, all witnesses to a shift in the invisible hierarchy. Harlem had felt tremors of power before, but nothing like this. This was more than a warning. This was a declaration. Loyalty, respect, and restraint defined authority. From across the street, a few men from rival corners lingered, hands twitching near concealed weapons. Yet they paused, understanding the lesson. Bumpy Johnson's reach was not limited to himself. It extended through his family, through the city, through the very air they breathed. A single act, controlled and deliberate, could bend the street to his will. In the aftermath, the city hummed with whispers, each retelling more exaggerated, yet each carrying the undeniable truth. The balance of power had shifted. A mobster had fallen in broad daylight, and the message was clear. In Bumpy's Harlem, the rules were absolute. The shot was over, but the echoes lingered. Fear, respect, and loyalty now intertwined, shaping the streets for years to come. And at the center of it all, calm and unshaken, stood the woman who had carried Bumpy Johnson's authority into the light of day. By nightfall, the streets of Harlem whispered with rumor and dread. News traveled faster than any siren. In dimly lit back rooms, men with expensive suits and colder hearts gathered, their cigars smoldering, their eyes sharp with calculation. The word had come from every corner. The mobster had been shot in broad daylight. And not just shot by the wife of Bumpy Johnson. Shock rippled through their ranks. In the world they had mastered, power was enforced with muscle, intimidation, and careful planning. But this defiance was unpredictable. It struck at the very core of their pride. A message encoded in violence, yet wrapped in precision. They could feel it in their bones. They had underestimated Bumpy Johnson, underestimated the reach of his influence, underestimated the quiet strength of his family. Plans were whispered, retribution considered, but every suggestion faltered against the unspoken rule that governed Harlem. Bumpy's authority was absolute, his reach unassailable. Any act of revenge would be measured not by bravado, but by inevitability, and those who miscalculated paid with more than their lives. Meanwhile, in Harlem, the streets adjusted themselves. Shopkeepers lowered their blinds, children were called inside, and men who usually strode with swagger now moved with cautious steps. Conversation leaned toward respect, toward caution, toward an understanding that the rules had changed. One act had shifted the balance, and the city felt the weight. From the shadows, a few loyalists watched, silently guarding the corners, their eyes flicking to the streets where whispers had become rumors. They had learned long ago that power carried in silence was far more dangerous than power displayed with guns drawn. And so they waited, observing, calculating, ensuring that Bumpy's dominion remained unchallenged. The Mafia, for all its planning and threats, realized something crucial. Fear alone could not undo the message delivered that afternoon. Respect, earned, demanded, unyielding, was a force they could not bargain against. Bumpy Johnson's name alone reshaped their caution into restraint. Any overt move would invite consequences measured with cold precision. By midnight, the city had absorbed the shock. The story would ripple through Harlem for years. A woman, a gun, a calculated strike, and a lesson in power that even the most hardened criminals could not ignore. In the shadows, Bumpy Johnson's authority grew, not through violence, but through the inevitability that followed it. Harlem understood the stakes now. The Mafia might plot, they might scheme, but against Bumpy, against his reach, against the quiet force of his family, they would pause. They would respect, and in that pause lay the greatest power of all. Bumpy Johnson arrived just as Harlem settled into uneasy darkness. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The streets had already absorbed the lesson, the warning carried by the gunshot that still lingered in memory. Every corner, every stoop, every shadow knew the rules now. He moved with quiet purpose, each step deliberate, each glance commanding attention without a word. Those who had witnessed the chaos of the afternoon parted instinctively, like water flowing around stone. Authority was not announced here. It was observed, understood, and obeyed. Inside a small gathering of his closest allies, Bumpy's presence was enough to still the tension. No one spoke, and yet the message was clear. The day had been settled, the balance restored, and any further disrespect would be met with consequences both precise and absolute. Power, Bumpy knew, was strongest when restrained, when measured, when inevitable. From the shadows, men from rival factions watched, their bravado dampened by a sudden, hard respect. The same men who once believed fear could bend Harlem to theirs will now recognize something different. Power did not roar here. It moved silently, like a current beneath the streets, and those who tried to resist it risked being pulled under without warning. Bumpy approached his wife. No words passed between them, no need. The weight of their shared authority filled the space. She had acted decisively, with precision, delivering a message that was clear, brutal, and entirely controlled. And now, in his presence, that action became immortalized, not as reckless vengeance, but as a reinforcement of order, respect, and community loyalty. Harlem understood the new hierarchy. The Mafia would retreat, their schemes paused by the unspoken threat of what a single misstep could invite. The city, for all its chaos, had recognized the truth. Bumpy Johnson was not defined by violence alone, but by the calculated power he projected through every move, every silence, every measured glance. And in that silence, the city bowed, not to terror, not to anger, but to inevitability. Loyalty and respect were preserved. Authority was unquestioned, and Bumpy Johnson's legacy, reinforced through calm domination, stretched beyond the street, beyond the moment, beyond the memory of a single shot fired in broad daylight. The city exhaled slowly, as if Harlem itself had survived a storm and now measured the damage. The streets, once alive with murmurs of fear and defiance, began to settle into a rhythm dictated not by chaos, but by authority. The mobster lay silent, his arrogance extinguished in an instant, leaving behind only the whisper of inevitability. Bumpy's wife moved through the aftermath with quiet assurance. No celebration, no display, only the steady presence of someone who had enacted power with precision, someone whose actions were an extension of a man whose reputation had been forged in the crucible of Harlem. Eyes followed her, not in fear alone, but in recognition. Respect was earned, and today it had been demanded. Stories traveled, muttered over stoops and in dimly lit corners, growing with each retelling. But the essence remained unchanged. A single act had reshaped the balance of power. Harlem had learned a truth both simple and profound. Bumpy Johnson's reach extended beyond himself, beyond violence, beyond mere intimidation. His authority lived in the silence that followed, in the loyalty it inspired, and in the moral code it enforced. Even the Mafia, far from Harlem streets, understood. They plotted less, calculated more, and in their reticence, they acknowledged a lesson they could not undo. Every move they made would now be measured against the weight of Bumpy Johnson's presence, a presence that had extended through his family, through his community, and into legend. In the quiet that followed, Bumpy walked the streets, not as a conqueror, not as a tyrant, but as a guardian of order, a steward of respect, a man whose authority had been both demonstrated and immortalized. Harlem's heartbeat aligned with his. Loyalty was strengthened. Violence was restrained. Fear existed, yes, but carefully tempered, harnessed, disciplined. And when the sun rose the next morning, it shone on a city transformed. The story of a shot fired in broad daylight, of a mobster humbled, of a wife who carried her husband's power into the streets, would linger in the alleys, the stoops, the whispers of Harlem for generations. Bumpy Johnson's legacy was no longer only his own. It lived in the silence, in the loyalty, in the authority etched into the very soul of the city he had mastered. And that legacy, calm, controlled, absolute, would endure,